And we are joined by our special guest tonight, Thomas Sheridan, all the way from Ireland, wrote just a really insightful, magnificent book, Labyrinth of the Psychopath. Puzzling People, Labyrinth of the Psychopath, which we'll be talking about tonight. And it looks like I didn't get as much of that passage I wanted to share with the listeners, Thomas, before that break. So if you would, why don't you kind of finish that up for us, where we were going with that, and how infatuation is kind of a tool that sometimes psychopaths use.
Hi, Christy. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you. So good to have you here. Yeah.
I'll just continue on without actually reading it, what that paragraph says about infatuation. Well, we mistake infatuation sometimes for actual genuine bonding, and it's two completely different things. And what happens with the infatuation is when these psychopathic individuals are preying upon us, are preying upon people that they're targeting. Everyone to them is a target of one form or another. They indulge in something called love bombing. Now, what love bombing does is it actually changes your brain. It changes your brain chemicals. What happens is when you are bombarded with this, it's like almost a form of extreme flattery, sycophantic behavior, and constant praise. Oh, you're wonderful, oh, you're amazing, blah, 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 blah. What happens is large amounts of dopamine are produced by your brain. Okay, and what happens at the same time is serotonin activity drops, and what happens then is that dopamine is also linked to the parts of the brain which are also linked to addictions. So what happens is the psychopath knows that when you were being loved bombed by the psychopath, your dopamine levels are increasing, and what's happening is you're becoming addicted to the lines that they're feeding you. And this is very important. And what's really spooky about that is they somehow learn it from the time they're a kid. So it's because they don't have the same inner emotional worlds we have, they have time to figure out that certain things that they do will result in responses from people in their targeting. And that's quite frightening because they learn this at a very, very young age, usually in their early teens. So what's actually happening is your chemicals in your brain are being changed, and that's what infatuation is.
Wow. When I read that, oh my God, it makes so much sense because, one thing I knew was that they always, the ones in my life anyways, it kind of started off the same way. Come on, really strong, real hot and cold, and I learned to recognize that, they all start off this way, but I had no idea that it was actually changing the chemicals in our brains, which made it so enticing or even kind of broke us down or made us weaker so that we thought that was love or became even, in fact, addicted to it and therefore put up with things that we normally wouldn't put up with to get that feeling again. So that's really shocking.
Yeah, what you're being attracted to is an addiction to a chemical that's been created by a persona that a psychopath is using to work you.
Amazing. My goodness. Thank you so much for explaining that, and we're certainly going to get more into that tonight. But, Thomas, I'd like to hear a little bit more about you and your path, why you became interested in this subject. And I've been looking at your beautiful artwork, and if, in fact, if the art inspired the book or your path or the other way around.
Well, actually, that's a great question. No one's ever asked me that before. I don't know. I think everything is... We are the sum total of all the experiences in our lives, no matter what we do. Our relationships, our working lives, our whatever... Our creative lives, it's all the same thing. I think for me, how I became interested in this subject, and actually, now that you mention it, it was to do with creativity. I played in the music business for a while, and I'd moved to New York to play in a band there, and I had a great time. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s. When I left the band, I started studying graphic design, and I got a job working in Wall Street investment banks, and that was when I met this individual who was it was kind of like a friend of mine. More of an acquaintance, but he kind of gave me the creeps at first when I met him, which is a common story when people meet these people. But he kind of buddied up to me because he knew I played guitar and he wanted to learn how to play. So it became, I wouldn't say a friendship, but it was almost like an acquaintance that was like friendly and kind of fun. And then one day out of the blue, he completely blurted out to me on lunch break that he was been clinically diagnosed as a psychopath. And I didn't know what, I thought a psychopath was an axe murderer or something like that. And he explained to me like that he'd been driving his family crazy for years. With this, like, he came from quite a wealthy New York family. They've been driving him crazy for years with this dysfunctional behavior. You know, he used to do things like steal his father's friends' cars and go on wild weekends with, like, women and stuff like that, and use his parents' credit cards and stuff. He was completely out of control. Even though he came from an affluent family, it was the thrill of doing these crazy things.
Sounds like Charlie Sheen.
And the funny thing is, he kind of looked a bit like him, which is kind of scary. But,
oh my goodness!
And then what happened then was that became to me a sort of an open doorway into a whole world of psychopathology that I didn't previously know about. So it was almost like I had entered their world, because he then started to tell me about what it felt like, how he lived his life, what his emotion. Well, he didn't have any emotions other than negative ones. And then he started to point out other people in the office who he told me that he knew were psychopaths, because they have an instinctual radar for each other. It's very, very interesting. It's almost like predatory creatures who don't impose on each other's hunting ground. It's almost like an honor among thieves kind of thing. And they were people that I kind of had a hunch that something wasn't right with them, and they either kind of frightened me, or they seemed kind of emotionally dead to me or something. And that began. And that's how the journey began, a fascination with the subject from that point on. And, you know, I'm the kind of person that when I get into something, I become, well, I'm not obsessed, but I just want to know everything about it. And I just read every book on the subject, even like down to like clinical studies from like teaching hospitals and everything. And when I was uncovering this information, I found it incredibly healing in my own life. And my attitude was, well, like, this is really good stuff. Why isn't there more of this? Why doesn't everyone know this? So then one thing led to another, and I started making videos and putting them on YouTube, and from that I ended up getting a book published from it. And that was the idea, to take this important information, which is very, very healing, very powering, and make sure, you know, everybody gets it. As many people as possible get this information, because you would not believe how much it can help you.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. Let me ask you this, though. You mentioned going through journals and scientific studies and such. How does your view differ from the traditional, you know, psychology or academia or the DSM would have us believe?
Well, firstly, I've been directly involved with them, where, say, you know, a scientist wouldn't, or a researcher.
Yeah.
And or a doctorate. Usually they don't. Like the most famous people in the field, like Martha Stout and Robert Hare, they actually say they've never actually been in a relationship with one. So they'll actually say, other than having to work with them in studies, they you know, the whole thing is, nothing is like experience.
Exactly.
And it's like how does someone who's been a victim of a pedophile, you know, explain to somebody, you know, someone who's not a victim of a pedophile can relate to what it felt like for a child to go through that. It's the same kind of idea. And so it's not that I differ from them, but a lot of their books and a lot of these were very, very technical. And, you know, they spend a long time talking about, things like, you know, brain chemistry and electrical aspects of the human brain, which is all very interesting and all very real. But people who are in this situation and have their lives damaged, they just want to get down to the nitty-gritty. How do these people find me? How do I avoid them? And how do they function, and how do you recover? And that's why that's what the need was. I felt there was a need to almost like produce a guidebook that anyone could understand without getting too technical.
You did a magnificent job, and I just want to say my experience with psychology is that psychology kind of gets us to blame ourselves. Well, there must be something wrong with you, or you wouldn't be attracting these people in your life, or, you know, things like, so then the blame game continues, and then you end up hating yourself, and blah, 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 what am I doing wrong? And then you fall into one trap after another, you know, well, maybe even a lifelong succession of psychopaths. And so I love how you put the information together so real with real life experiences, instead of just reading it in a book, where maybe